So, Walk the Line, which, multiply nominated, and of course scored a resounding victory at the Golden Globes, where Joaquin Phoenix and Reese Witherspoon both won actor and actress in a musical or comedy, because obviously in the Globes they split them up. They have, serious, dramatic, and then for musical or comedy. Biopic of Johnny Cash's early life. And it's the story of Johnny Cash from his childhood to somebody who gets married and then decides to become a musician, signs up with Sam Phillips, who hears something in his voice, despite the fact that he is playing with two mechanics who, by their own admission, can't hardly play, and Cash himself can't hardly sing. He then becomes part of the Sun Records roadshow, so goes on tour with Jerry Lee Lewis and Elvis Presley. And whilst this is happening, finds himself in the company of June Carter, who, of course, he famously ended up marrying after proposing to her on stage. Now, in the film, when he proposes to her on stage, you think this, obviously this is fairy tale and this is made up. Of course, there are some ellipses and some, things that are made up in the film, but actually the proposal on stage is not one of them. But the heart of the film is the relationship between Cash and Carter, brilliantly played by Phoenix and Witherspoon. Here's a clip. Now, that is one of three moments in Walk the Line in which the film does the thing that all biopics have to do, and at which point they risk ridicule. She says, "You can't walk no line," and of course he ends up writing Walk the Line. There's another moment earlier on when Johnny Cash sits down and watches that film inside the walls of Folsom Prison, and then we see him strumming a guitar, feeling tormented and going, "But I shot a man in Reno just to watch him die," which is, of course, the classic Johnny Cash line.
Can I say on that point, that specific line, earlier that you mentioned it,
yeah.
I shot a man in Reno
just to
watch him die. That must be, and that was 1955. That was his second hit. If a gangster rapper did a line like that,
yeah,
there would be howls of protest.
Oh, it is. I mean, it is extraordinary, and it is basically the thing that came to crystallise what was then thought of as Johnny Cash's sort of outlaw renegade status. Because, of course, I mean, he wasn't an outlaw. He was arrested a couple of times, but he was only ever in prison for like one night. And there's a lovely line in the film in which, when he does get arrested, and his dad says, "Now you won't have to try so hard to convince people you're a criminal." And there's another moment when, after he's in a complete state, and June Carter has seen him in this complete state, and then she's then on her own thinking about him in this terrible state, and she says, it burns, and of course he then goes on to start writing Ring of Fire. Now, if you're a fan of pop biopics, which I am, you know that this is the difficult moment, like that awful moment in The Doors when Ray Manzarek goes hang on, excuse me, can you just leave me for a minute? Then you hear him playing the break. There's another line in the Buddy Holly story which I think Walk the Line is closest to. I love the Buddy Holly story. It's directed by Steve Rash from 1978. Gary Busey, fantastic performance as Buddy Holly, in which he sang all his own songs. And in fact, they released a soundtrack album with the Crickets playing the backing and Gary Busey singing the Buddy Holly stuff. And it's brilliant. The roller derby sequence when they're doing Rocking Around with Ollie V, and you can tell that they're playing live, is great. But there's a scene when they're in the back of a car and one of them's singing this song, and it goes, "If you knew Cindy Lou," and one of them says, "That just doesn't sound right.
Oh,
what's the name of that girl you've been dating?" And then they go on to write, Peggy. So, fine. You always have to do those moments in pop biopics, and if you get away with them, it's an indication that the film is working really well. The fact that Walk the Line does three of them, and at no point do you think, "Oh no, I'm sorry, I've had it," is an indication of just how good it is. And the reasons it's good are primarily Joaquin Phoenix and Reese Witherspoon are just dynamite in those performances. Joaquin Phoenix does a brilliant job of playing not only the physical manner of Johnny Cash, because he did have a very strange physical stance. It was, his shoulders were hoiked. He held his guitar in a way which, to some extent, I kind of suppose was similar to Eddie Cochran, kind of like the rifle stance. But he also had a peculiar walk. It was like uncertain and yet unstoppable at the same time. And when he starts singing, he has this kind of faltering, ordinary, very airy sort of voice, but during the course of the movie his voice seems to drop right down into his boots as Johnny's soul descends into the Ring of Fire. And halfway through the film you're thinking, is he singing this or is that Johnny Cash? Because that really sounds like Johnny Cash to me. And of course all the way through it is Joaquin Phoenix. I did wonder whether he'd had a little bit of electronic enhancement, which would be possible, but he does it brilliantly. Reese Witherspoon apparently says that she wasn't a singer before this, and yet she does the June Carter stuff, and in a way she's got the harder role, because June Carter is seen to some extent as a sort of flibberty-gibbet, somebody who's a musical comedy act.
We'll do some more on this in just a moment, and if you have seen it, a number of people have already. Your correspondence, welcome, of course, mayo@bbc.co.uk. First of all, 3:20. This email from John McCafferty. Simon, I watched Walk the Line a couple of weeks ago and quite enjoyed it. Then I read the new authorised biography of Johnny Cash by Steve Turner, which is wonderful, by the way, and realised that Walk the Line is terribly watered down in typical Hollywood fashion. Sure, great acting and music, but all the critical parts of the story are sadly omitted or swept under the carpet.
Okay, well, I'd like to deal with this because I know that the criticism that's levelled against it is you don't see the real darkness of the Johnny Cash character. What you see is a man, troubled by inner demons, very much like the setup in Ray, that early on he loses his brother and he kind of is blamed for the loss of his brother, and then he descends into drug addiction and drinking and angst about, there's a moment when Jerry Lee Lewis, when they're all in the car together, and Jerry Lee Lewis says, as he really did in real life, we're all going to hell, because Lewis was particularly conflicted about, on the one hand, he had this Southern church upbringing, on the other hand, he was playing what he seriously believed was the devil's music. Now, I think you have to take pop biopics not as documentaries, as pop biopics. And considering the amount of possible glossing over that could have been done, what I thought Walk the Line did was exactly got the right balance. It doesn't do it as a documentary. Bear in mind that the story had a lot of input from Cash and Carter as well, so obviously they are doing to some extent their own version of their story, and it is a fairy tale. But the reason I forgive it for that is that the most ridiculous fairy tale invention, which is the onstage proposal, is true. And it is true that although after Cash and Carter got together, that wasn't the end of his problems by some way. However, that narrative works perfectly well for me in exactly the same way that the Buddy Holly story, which in fact leaves out an entire band member and changes people's names because there was issues about who owned the copyright to that story, still works as a story. It's not a factual document. Yes, it plays fast and loose with the truth when it feels that it needs to, but it's like the Ballad of Bonnie and Clyde's version of the Bonnie and Clyde story. It is a romanticised version of their story told by the prince and princess of the fairy tale themselves. And the other thing I'd like to say, and this is important, the music is produced by T-Bone Burnett, and I get terribly antsy about seeing bands playing in films and not looking like they're playing.
T-Bone Burnett is a genius and has been a fantastic producer for years.
Yeah, he really is. And the moment at which I thought, I love this movie, and it can do no wrong for me from now on, is when they start playing as a three-piece, and the guy who's playing the double bass is playing the double bass, and he's got the notes stuck up the side of the double bass, which if you play double bass, you'd know that is how you start out playing double bass. And then they're on stage and he starts slapping. Now, I play slap bass, and I have seen people miming playing slap bass, and I just want to take the bass and smack them with it. Watching somebody actually get slap bass playing, catgut string playing right in a film was nothing short of miraculous for me. And I thought, that's it. Nothing you can do from now on is going to mess this up. You've actually got a double bassist looking like he's doing it. Yes, fine. It's peculiar and quirky to me, but for all the things about, you don't get the real dark side of Cash's character, you don't get the real underbelly of what happened, what you do get is somebody really playing the bass, and a fantastic fairy tale that takes its lead from a true life romance and does just enough compression and elision to make it work. And I thought it was a real return to form for James Mangold, whose early work, Heavy and Copland, was great, but then went off and did nonsense like Identity. And I think he's really found his feet. Phoenix and Carter are... Phoenix and Witherspoon are Cash and Carter. I've now seen it 3 times. I loved it to bits, and I don't care that it's not absolutely factually on the money. It's a pop biopic, and for me it's up there with the Buddy Holly story, it's up there with Slade in Flame. It's much better than Ray, for example, which I think is much more earnest and worthy, but much less magical.
I wanted more music. I think that...
Oh, really?
Yeah, I wanted more of the stuff on stage because he does that so well.
He does do it so well,
particularly when he does Walk the Line, and particularly when he does Ring of Fire, which haven't got the horns on it, which the single version. I'm thinking there was a moment where I thought, actually, this is better.
Yeah, it's really, really fantastic.
And I suppose that there may well be now Johnny Cash revival. If you go into most record stores at the moment, they've got lots of best-ofs. They've got the soundtrack. They've got the aforementioned Steve Turner biography of Johnny Cash. And what's interesting about him is that a lot of people say he kept his best music to the last 10 years of his life. All the stuff he did with Rick Rubin is quite stunning. that would be another story altogether.
Yeah, and of course there's all the connection with Nick Lowe. And yes, there is a whole other story still to be written about that. But for what this is, I mean, I don't say this lightly. It is up there with the Buddy Holly story, and if you know what I think about that movie, I cannot praise it highly enough.
You're